Time travel in Star Trek is arguably one of the best we've ever seen on the big screen. But that's just one thing about this amazing show. There are lots of exciting scenes that most fans forget about, especially with Spock. Plus, the original series didn't get a finale until Star Trek VI. But why did they make their loyal viewers wait so long until they got a conclusion to the series? Let's find out. First off, why was the wait so long? Contrary to what most people think, the show was canceled for a long time. But even though it was canceled in 1969, it came right back to its fans in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered, in 1991. As for why it got canceled in the first place, it ran for 3 seasons, but as popular as it is today, it wasn't initially and did not get strong ratings. Thankfully, it gained a small but very loyal sci-fi fanbase who banded together to save the show. Unfortunately, it made a reappearance, but in the 10 p.m. Friday night time slot. But at least it was back to give anxious fans a conclusion, right? It shouldn't really come as a surprise why it was canceled in the first place, because sci-fi wasn't really that popular in the late 60s. Sure, all the sci-fi we see in Marvel movies today is awesome to see. People didn't really have a taste for these kind of shows back then. The vibes back then didn't really have proper storylines or needed an ending, but all that changed with Star Trek. But since the show was different, it went on to end the Enterprise's 5-year mission, and it got its 5th season to fill everybody's appetite. Next up, how everything changed after the series finale. Star Trek gained more popularity than it had on NBC, and why wouldn't it? After all, with episodes running multiple times a week all across the USA, fans got what they wanted. By the mid-1970s, Paramount started thinking about a Star Trek Phase 2 TV series as their next project. But 2 years before that, with the success of Star Wars in 1977, Star Trek developed into a thriving film series, with the original cast appearing in a total of 6 films, especially the wildly popular Star Trek The Motion Picture, which they developed out of Phase 2 in 1979. In the meantime, the TV series also got revived in 1987 with Star Trek The Next Generation. Let's talk more about the true finale, Star Trek VI. The Star Trek TOS film's biggest box office hit was 1986's Star Trek VI, The Voyage Home. But after 1989's Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, the Star Trek TOS film's biggest box office hit was 1986's Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. But after 1989's Star Trek V, The Final Frontier underwhelmed. The films starring the original cast were all but abandoned. But even so, Paramount veered off course and decided that the original actors needed one more film as a send-off before Star Trek The Next Generation made the transition to the big screen. The new prequel, Star Trek The Academy Years, about the young Kirk and Spock, was seriously considered. In the end, William Shatner's Captain Kirk and his original crew had the happy ending that they had long been due in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Kirk and his crew are characterized in their best light in Star Trek VI, which is an intense and rewarding final mission. The Starship Enterprise leaves the galaxy for the last time after saving it, with Kirk's voiceover passing the baton to another crew. The Star Trek actors etched their names in the stars as well, and Avengers Endgame did the same thing in 2019. The majority of the cast believed that Star Trek VI's proper ending would be damaged if they made appearances in Star Trek Generations. Either way, the TOS cast was the only Star Trek cast to have a perfect ending to their film series with Star Trek VI, which they had been waiting 22 years for. Moving on, why does Star Trek focus on time travel so heavily? Our favorite Star Trek characters travel through time a lot, rewriting history or catching a glimpse of the future in their expeditions aboard the Enterprise. These stories usually involve fantasy and investigation of how the past affects the future. With everything else science fiction fans enjoy, our heroes are usually forced to deal with fixing a broken timeline when they go back in time. Other times, though, Star Trek uses time travel to show how the tiniest mistakes can damage history. Sometimes they show how a single action can have huge consequences, and how a single decision can affect the future of millions of people. There have been many epic episodes, but we're gonna stick with the ones that sent Starfleet's elite personnel years into the past, or further into the future to see what could have been. From the city on the edge of forever to the Star Trek Deep Space Nine love letter to the original series. Don't go anywhere, because we're about to talk about 2 of the best Star Trek voyages. Not to mention the City on the Edge of Forever episode, the time travel romance, The City on the Edge of Forever, generally regarded as the best episode of the Star Trek The Original Series, sees the Enterprise visit a planet that's home to a strange cosmic being known as the Guardian of Forever, a living gateway that peeks into the past and future. In 1930 New York City, McCoy throws himself through the portal after taking too much cordrazine accidentally. And you know what that means? He was sent into a state of insanity. All of history is transformed in an instant after this, and the United Federation of Planets seizes ceases to exist. Kirk and Spock chase McCoy to fix the damage after realizing that McCoy must have changed history in some way. When Kirk and Spock arrive, they seek refuge at Edith Keeler's homeless shelter. Kirk and Edith fall in love while they look for McCoy and try to stop him from changing the timeline. Meanwhile, Spock links to the historical shift to Keeler's death, who gets destined for death in a car accident that McCoy will prevent, and Kirk gets devastated by this revelation in the process. In a sci-fi tragedy that has Shakespearean elements, Kirk is compelled to act and stop his friend from rescuing the one he loves in order to fix the past and preserve all of human history. Next up, the Trials and Tribulations episode from Deep Space Nine. Now, let's talk about the second most favorite time travel voyage, the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Trials and Tribulations, which was created to commemorate the franchise's 30th anniversary in 1996 as a tribute to the original Star Trek series. This was the episode where a human refugee rescued from Cardassia gets sent home on the Defiant when he steals access to the Bajoran Orb of Time and rushes backward more than 100 years, altering the course of history, when they discover that the refugee was actually Arn Darvin, a Klingon in disguise who had caused trouble for Captain Kirk in the past. It was up to Sisko and his crew to correct history, using Forrest Gump methods. The episode masterfully blends old footage with brand new sequences and plugs Sisko, Bashir, Dax, and the rest into the scenes on the Enterprise, where they even get to interact with Captain Kirk. Not to mention, it became one of the most popular episodes in the franchise by incorporating the cast of Deep Space Nine into a classic Star Trek episode. Let's talk about how Star Trek's original movie removed every Spock replacement. When the actor ultimately decided to rejoin the franchise, Star Trek the Motion Picture cut 2 prospective Spock replacements. Not to mention, it took 10 years for the live-action adventures of the Enterprise crew to continue after Star Trek was canceled in 1969. And let's just say, there were a bunch of attempts made at reviving Star Trek as a TV series called Star Trek Phase 2. During this transition phase, in reaction to the unexpected popularity of the Star Trek original series in reruns. Surprisingly, Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock, was only given the chance to appear in 2 of the 13 planned episodes. In fact, Nimoy claimed that his biography, I Am Not Spock, may have unintentionally given his Star Trek co-stars, Gene Roddenberry and Paramount, the idea that he no longer wanted to be associated, even though the actual cause of his declined participation is still unknown. David Gautreaux, who stood in for costume and makeup trials, was cast as the new Vulcan character, Zahn. The plans for Zahn had to change when Phase 2 was scrapped in favor of a theatrical release, because director Robert Wise requested that Spock should be included in the film. Of course, he lived long and prospered in the eyes of many Star Trek fans, so he had to be included. And finally, let's address how the Star Trek motion picture wouldn't have worked without Spock. Spock is essential to the original Star Trek film because the emotional arc of the narrative is powered by his ineffective spiritual journey. Although the motion picture reunites the TOS cast 10 years later successfully, bringing all of our favorite characters together once again for one last hurrah. It's essentially a movie about finding your true calling even at a later part in your life. Sure, Spock fails the Vulcan Kolinar rite, which is intended to purify all emotions during his debut, but Spock also finds a connection to the sentient former satellite as the Enterprise investigates the Vagur issue, because he's also thinking about his own life in the process. There's absolutely no denying that the original Star Trek movie succeeded because Spock plays a central role in the film's existential exploration of meaning. It would not have the same emotional pull if it had been Zahn, a brand new figure who old and newer Star Trek fans knew nothing about. If Vigor is simply another heartless Vulcan, the scene in which Spock cries after finally seeing him would not have had the same impact, even though certain fan bases might not enjoy Star Trek the motion picture. It would have been far worse without Leonard Nimoy's performance, so let's just be grateful for that. And with all that, that's a wrap on today's video. Could Star Trek have become as popular as it is today without Spock, or did we need this Vulcan to bring life to the whole franchise? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.